I just wanted to give a little bit of context about what the lecture is today and what the IGU addresses here on campus. So this lecture and the IGU overall would not be possible here at Monmouth without the vision and dedication of two faculty members who are here in the audience today, Dr. Ramu Damodaran, who was the founding director of the IGU, and Dr. Saliba Sarsar, who served as vice provost for international programs here at Monmouth and was involved in directing the trajectory of the IGU as well. And so they've been fantastic resources as I've navigated my 2 years here as director of the IGU, and just grateful for their support and wisdom in planning this year's event. One of the pillars of the IGU's mission is to promote relations with the UN, to ensure that our programming is coordinating with the UN's activities to give faculty and students an opportunity to engage with the UN. And we certainly have been challenged a bit with the pandemic to reinitiate a lot of those relationships, but it's very exciting to have one foundational member of that relationship with the UN here to be honored today as the recipient of this award. Just wanted to remind you that this event is co-sponsored by the Freed Endowed Chair in Social Sciences, which Dr. Ramu Damodaran currently holds, and we're grateful for that support. And I wanted to say just a sense of the roadmap of what's going to be covered today. We are fortunate to have President Leahy here to give some opening remarks. And after that, Dr. Sarsar will provide an introduction of our featured guest and awardee. And he will then receive the award, the Global Visionary Award, and then he will present the lecture to us today. And we will conclude with a Q&A session. And that's available both to the in-person and the Zoom attendees for today's event. So without further ado, I'd like to bring the President of Monmouth University, Dr. Patrick Leahy, to offer some welcoming remarks.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's so nice to see all of you here in person and those joining via the remote feed. In particular, thrilled to see so many of our students here. So thank you all for being here. Randy, thank you for giving me this brief opportunity to say a few words. More importantly, I want to thank you for your leadership of the IGU here at Monmouth. I am so pleased to support the efforts of the IGU here at Monmouth. As I understand it, this evolved from the Global Understanding Project that started way back, am I right, Saliba? Way back in 2001. Ramu Damodaran, who was a professor here at Monmouth at the time, was so instrumental in starting this program. I think all of you know Dr. Damodaran as a professor here. She is the holder of the Freed Chair. And something that you may not remember, especially if you're new here to Monmouth, and that is that she led this university as interim provost through 2 of the toughest years in our history, right in the middle of the global pandemic. So I want to thank you, Ramu, for your service in all those ways here at Monmouth. As Randy suggested, the goal of the IGU is pretty simple, and that is to promote awareness of global affairs and to foster cross-cultural understanding, greater cross-cultural understanding. And the IGU does this a number of different ways. One is we host a lot of different events here on campus, like the one that we're hosting today. 2, the IGU supports faculty members and hopefully their student research assistants in writing about global affairs. And number 3, it cultivates strategic partnerships, both on campus, of course, but also off campus. And one of the most important of those off-campus partnerships is with the United Nations. In the past, we have been a part of the United Nations Department of Global Communications Program, and we are involved in the United Nations Academic Impact Program. And our hope is today and in the future, we will continue to bring distinguished speakers here to campus from the United Nations, like today's distinguished speaker, Ramu Damodaran, who was the former chief of the UN Academic Impact Program, but you'll hear more about him in just a moment. I am so pleased to have him, a longtime friend of Monmouth University, back to campus. Welcome, Ramu.
Thank you.
I also want to just share with you a quick story, if I may. Okay, Saliba. One of the great privileges of my life was that I had a chance to speak at the United Nations 2 times. Did you know that?
No.
2 times I had a chance to speak at the United Nations in a previous job. I just want to tell you this quick story. The first time I had a chance to speak, we were in the trusteeship council room. It was full of people. And the first speaker presented, he was introduced and he delivered nice remarks. And then I was the next speaker and I was introduced. And when I was introduced, a roar went up in the gallery. I mean, quite unconventional roar went up in the gallery. And they asked me who that was. I said, those are the 50 students we brought from the university. And the president at Babson College, who was the next speaker, said to me, I didn't realize you could bring your own cheering section to the United Nations. And I said, I didn't ask, I just brought them. So for the rest of my life, I will have a special feeling about the United Nations. And I hope while I'm the president here, we can continue to strengthen our partnership with the UN. Let me just close with a serious statement here, and that is that institutes like the IGU are as important as ever. Not only this one, but institutes like it on college campuses all over the world. And one need only look at the events in Ukraine to realize that we must continue to push for greater cross-cultural understanding when it comes to geopolitical matters. And whenever there's a topic like this, I'm reminded of one of our US presidents, President Kennedy, who gave a speech on peace in 1963 at the commencement ceremony at American University in Washington, D.C. You students, if you have not ever heard that speech, I encourage you to find it online and to read it or listen to it. You can actually listen to it. But at one point, President Kennedy, in my opinion, sums it all up when he says, for in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this same small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. So I hope it's with that understanding that we might continue to work as a campus and, of course, support the United Nations in their efforts to make it safe for us to live together on this same small planet. So I just want to now turn the program over to one of those individuals who has dedicated, if I may say, his life to promoting greater cross-cultural understanding, in particular in the Holy Land. Dr. Saliba Sarsar, as some of you may know, he was himself a student and now a graduate at Monmouth University. He has been a longtime professor here at our university. He was, as Randy mentioned, a one-time associate vice president or vice provost for global initiatives. And he is to this day, has been throughout his career, and is to this day an often cited expert on matters in particular as they relate to the Middle East. So it is a great joy for me to invite Dr. Sarsar up here to introduce more formally our speaker today. Saliba.
Thank you very much, President Leahy. Thank you, Mr. Ramu Damodaran, for your visit with us, and I welcome you wholeheartedly again to Monmouth University, and thanks to all of you for being with us as well. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Ramu Damodaran, and he is established for many, many years in the field of diplomacy in service to the United Nations as an international civil servant. He joined the United Nations Department of Global Communications in 1996. His responsibilities included oversight of relationships with civil society, the creative community, and celebrity advocates. He was also in charge of publications, including as chief editor of the UN Chronicle, the Dag Hammarskjöld Library, and the United Nations Academic Impact, as was mentioned before, which he was asked to devise and lead by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. He also was secretary of the United Nations General Assembly's Committee on Information and served as president of the United Nations Staff Recreation Council. He completed his career with the United Nations just last year in May 2021. Ramu's earlier UN Secretariat assignments included the Department of Special Political Questions and Peacekeeping, as well as speech writing in the Executive Office of the Secretary General. He was spokesman for the Durban Review Human Rights Conference in 2009 and has fulfilled a range of speaking engagements on behalf of the organization over his career. As a member of the Indian Foreign Service, where he was promoted to the rank of ambassador, Ramu served as executive assistant to the Prime Minister of India between 1991 and 1994, and earlier in the Ministries of External Affairs, Home Affairs, Defense, Planning, and Human Resource Development. Before joining government service in India, Ramu worked as a television news anchor, radio producer and host, and university correspondent for All India Radio and the Hindustan Times Evening News. His radio feature on university students in Delhi won the Asia Pacific Broadcasting Union Award. Ramu has been a key architect in helping Monmouth University and the IGU become a United Nations Department of Global Communications NGO of higher education and a founding partner of the UN Academic Impact. Under his leadership, since 2010, UNAI has enlisted close to 2,000 institutions of higher education worldwide, spanning from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe. UNAI helps colleges and universities promote the core principles of the Charter of the United Nations through education. World peace, human rights, and sustainable, equitable development are some of its goals. Most importantly, UNAI helps students and faculty engage in innovative projects and ways to find solutions to real-life challenges that countries face using science, creative arts, and active learning. In recent years, Ramu has helped establish off-site internships for Monmouth students, invited students and faculty to participate at conferences at the UN headquarters in New York City, and established the UNAI lecture series. We are so happy to have you, and I ask now Professor Randy Abbey to come forward and give the award.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sarsar, for those excellent words recognizing our distinguished lecturer and recipient of this award. Hearing that bio, we do indeed have a true Renaissance man on our hands, and it's really an honor and a privilege to host him today for this event. And for his lifetime of dedication to the cause of world peace and development through education and prioritizing global understanding, we celebrate Mr. Ramu Damodaran today with the Monmouth University Global Visionary Award. Now we will hear from Mr. Damodaran for the Global Visionary Lecture.
Thank you. Thank you so much, President Leahy, Dr. Sarsar, Dr. Abeki. There's a certain symbolism to the award that you've given me, because the unwritten rule in the UN is that morning meetings, which are scheduled for 10 o'clock, always begin at 10:10. So thank you for that, and for reminding me of the years that I spent at the UN. It's an honor to be here to see faces live after an interval of about 2 years, I think. And I'm particularly proud to be here at a university which President Leahy once described as a human service enterprise. And I like that phrase because it brings in 3 elements which I think are common to a university like Monmouth and the United Nations. Human, because ultimately it is the people who constitute an organization and whose interests it serves. Even the United Nations, which is an organization of governments and member states, ultimately comes down to the common factor of the human person whose dignity and worth the United Nations Charter upholds. Service, because what happens here is not transactional. In a university, the leadership, the faculty, and the students serve. They serve the community, they serve each other. And above all, in a way that I think is sometimes underestimated or understated, they serve themselves. They serve themselves to become better, gentler, kinder, abler human beings. And so too it is at the United Nations, where we serve, and in the process of serving, a wealthy country serving a deprived one, a country at peace serving a country at war. In that process, the country that serves acquires as much benefit as the one that is served. And the idea of enterprise, because yes, a university, and I dare say particularly a private university, is in a sense an enterprise. It has to finance itself, it has to sustain itself. And so too is the United Nations, except that possibly our balance sheets are recorded less in figures of dollars and cents, but in the 1,000 good deeds that we do all over the world each day, and which the intellectual and emotional power of the university guides us through. I was so moved to be introduced by Rekha to this young lady who's worked in Afghanistan with an NGO. And I realized it's women like her, persons like her, who take that flag of human service enterprise forward. We meet today in a space designed by Julian Abel. And I think of this architect who also designed Duke University. He designed a university in whose halls he himself could never sit, because it was only in 1961 that desegregation came to Duke University. And it's almost like that old African proverb of planting a tree in whose shade you will never bask. So too did Julian Abel create a world, a space. In that sense, he too was a visionary, because he foresaw a time when the denial that he had lived under would not pass on to succeeding generations. And that, in a sense, is what I would like to share with you today. The idea of space. Space symbolized by architecture, by creation, but also the many spaces of human engagement that we have, whether as a university, whether as a student, whether as a government, or whether as United Nations. Last week, on the vernal equinox, a remarkable sight occurred in India, as it does twice every year on the vernal and autumnal equinox. There is a temple in the south of India, which was constructed in the year 1564, coincidentally the very year that Galileo was born. Galileo, who proved that the shadows of the moon's craters and rocks depend upon the movement of the sun. And this temple was constructed with 5 linear windows in the middle. So on that day, every 10 minutes, the sun's rays would move from the top window to the second, to the third, to the fourth, to the fifth. Think of that precision of astronomy, of engineering, and yes, sheer hard work, the creation of space, the idea that something which was holy, something which was almost intimate to the human person, could also be a source of the power that science afforded. And if you take that one step further and think also of the idea of space in the sense of making the most of what you had. How did this great university come into being? It originally did not have space for what was then Monmouth Junior College. But with innovation, the junior college chose to meet at 5 o'clock in the evening after the school had disbanded for the day. Again, optimal use of space. And when we think of that space also in the context of universities and the United Nations, we realize that we come to terms or have to come to terms with the most vital element that we need to safeguard and cherish. An element that Randy has so memorably described as the voiceless. Those who are without a voice, be they young people or generations unborn, be they wildlife, be they natural resources. And the idea that you have to come and synergize all of these, because if they were to have a voice, the demands that they would ask and the rights that they would expect would coincide. And so we, the university and the United Nations, have to be that voice for them. Some days ago, I listened to a podcast by the IGU. It was conducted by Anna Viazada, I believe, and she spoke to a lady called Marcia Conboy, who's leading an initiative for a public health convention on animal protection, which would promote public health, animal welfare, and the environment. There again, a question of space, creating the space of law and convention to be able to enforce sensible, practical, human ideas. And then you go beyond that to the ideas that our present Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, has put forward, of having a summit for the future in 2023, of having a special envoy for future generations. Because the one thing that we have realized, particularly over the last 2 years, is that you cannot protect yourselves without protecting those who come after you, which is the rationale of the succeeding generations in the United Nations Charter. And then you go beyond that, if you will, to the idea of adaptability of space. Provost Pamela Scott Johnson, when she was earlier at the University of California system in Los Angeles, coined a wonderful word, collaborati, or collaboratopi. The idea that when you have a physical space, it does not need to be confined for the purposes it was originally intended. You can have a music class in a food court. You can open your halls to theater, to the creative arts. And in that idea, bring forward the adaptability that is so vital to our times. Another idea and another element which is a physical question of space is what President Leahy referred to most recently in the instance of Ukraine, the idea of refugees. One of our most moving meetings involving Monmouth University and the United Nations was the annual Day of Social Work in 2016, where the theme was refugees, the dignity and worth of the human person. And I'm delighted to see Michael here, Michael Cronin, who was there at that event, and who said something which has remained in my mind. We're not, when we look at that space, we are not seeking perfection. It's like a club that gets together and says, maybe we should just try this. And very often, what you try turns out to be what was needed in the first place. Like the Refugees Convention. When we first devised it in 1951, the entire focus was on refugees caused because of or during the Second World War. 16 years later, in 1967, we transformed the definition and the landscape of refugees and created a true global movement, a space where everyone denied a voice at home could find that voice abroad. It is something which I think is also symbolized in the idea of the greening of social work, the Virginia Corey Common Gardens, the idea of working here to create plants and food that is tended not just for yourself, but to the community beyond. That sense of community, that sense of space. And then the idea of space for the unforeseen. Most vivid in this context, and this brings me back again to Randy's point about the voiceless, is the question of climate action. Over the last 50 years, there has been 115 lives and $202 million lost every day because of climate-related emergencies. This is a parched space. This is a devastated space. This is almost an abandoned space. But now we have the opportunity to reclaim it. And we have the figures, we have the maths. If you were today, if the world were today to invest $1.5 billion in early warning systems, every $800 million spent would save up to $16 billion in developing countries in the cost of disaster aversion. And so you have that idea of getting together with a practical level at the local sense and an ambitious global level, which requires the unity again of academic minds and government leaders. Graduate studies student Alessandra Conte in this university has studied the impact of houses after Hurricane Sandy and how they were rebuilt, and the idea of how a little bit of forewarning and foreplanning could have prevented their falling in the first place. The idea of space in the context of weather also brings to mind one of the earliest and most ambitious instances of cooperation between the world of governments, which the United Nations is today, and scholarship. This was in 1925, when we had the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was essentially a political body. But then it came to terms with the fact that there were so many more perils on the human landscape. And in 1925, the League of Nations asked a group of scientists, including Albert Einstein and Marie Curie, to come up with the idea of a World Meteorological Organization. Now, that organization only came to being 26 years later in 1951, but yet it had that authenticity of an academic solidity to it. And we find that here at this university, its parentage and leadership of the Urban Coast Institute under Dr. Tony McDonald, who has said, and this is such a powerful phrase, that responsibilities for marine, ocean, and water management are fractured between so many entities. Again, a question of space. You have a space where you can cohese, but you also have a space where you can let each element in it drift and go its own way. So the science-based Mid-Atlantic Plan is something which, within the specifics of the neighborhood of this great university, and for that matter, the larger neighborhood of the United Nations headquarters, is something which can, like the currents of the ocean itself, flow and invigorate other climes and other parts of the world. Two young artists from this university, Jessica Oriema and Kimberly Dallas, had evocative paintings in a publication we brought out of the Academic Impact. Jessica spoke about a post-human world, a world which would be entirely peopled, if that's the word to use, by non-humans. And Kimberly spoke about one's ecological self, designing a mask whose contours were the plants that live around us and whom we cherish. So this whole idea, if you will, of engagement through the creative arts, through each other, transforming within that space tried ideas of what you might call pedagogy and having new methods is something which will invigorate the United Nations itself. Dr. Raj Devasahayam has written at length and about the changing culture of laptop technology. Laptops began really as an instrument to take notes, but now you can use it as a form of engagement, of cooperation, a space for collaboration. And then again, the space of harnessing science to social cause. It's so ironical that the Nobel Prize that went to a resident of Monmouth, the oldest recipient of the award, Arthur Ashkin, some years ago, was for having devised optical tweezers, which could pick up a particle or a bacteria with a laser beam without harming it. Think of that precision to safeguard the integrity of a piece of scientific evidence. And then contrast that with a study which came out in Environment International magazine last week, which says for the first time, human beings, babies in particular, have been found with microplastic contaminants in their blood. So on the one hand, you bring the beauty and precision of science to be able to take you one step further on the journey to biological discovery and achievement. And on the other hand, you infiltrate your own bodies and beings with the danger that you individually, you collectively, and you internationally have the ability to protect. And then the idea of space for engagement. The idea of having space where, in the very memorable words of a student of this university, Webster Trammell of the class of 1973, you sit at the same table or sit at the same space, engage in differences, do not repel differences. And that idea which is coming here, earlier this month, the Leadership, Civility, and Common Ground in Politics and Public Service meeting, which brought together minds from both Republican and Democrat parties, which, as President Leahy says, show how representatives of opposing political parties can respectfully disagree on policy, but work together for common good. That space to work together for common good. And a space, again, for challenging assumptions. It was the Monmouth Polling Institute which discovered that only 20% of the Republicans it polled felt that Justice Brown Jackson should not be nominated to the Supreme Court. So you have a figure showing that people are not completely boxed in by the dimensions or the attributes that it would give to them. And while referring to that Supreme Court nominee, I must, Mr. President, also note that President Biden seems to have taken a leaf from your book when you said in your strategic plan that the faculty diversity must match the student diversity in this nomination to the Supreme Court. And then the space for breaking spaces. The idea of this theme of this lecture, from war to peace and human dignity. My cherished friend, Professor Rekha Datta, has spoken of the neighboring countries of India and Pakistan in a book entitled Beyond Realism. Yes, we need to be realist, but we can also go beyond realism. Because if you stop to think about it, everything, be it a political ideal, a humanitarian ideal, or a scientific achievement, has extended the realm of the real as was known at that time. Professor Sarsar, your work on the Holy Land Confederation again goes beyond the realism or the wisdom that we have been taught to accept and believe, to ideas which have brought together statesmen and public figures from the Arab world, from Israel, and from countries in the larger region, to try and think of a creative solution, something again, even as the war is going on in Ukraine, there is a track of that beyond realism, beyond the fact. Sometimes one feels when it comes to dealing with relations between nations that every government is somewhat like Noah Lead, your goaltender, trying to protect the lacrosse coming into your goal area. And that is fair enough, because governments need to be defensive by their very mandate. But then if you take that analogy a step further, surely governments can also explore options together, which might make the tending of that particular goal unnecessary. And this is really also a question of communion, of ideas, of minds. I think of, again, of Rekha and the International Service Seminar that she has been leading every year to Calcutta in India. Just before coming here, I saw the exhibit downstairs of Peace Corps volunteers in the first years of Monmouth. And there was one Peace Corps volunteer whose name was Neil Hidving. He had gone to Samoa. And in Samoa, they have a custom where when you go there as a volunteer, you stay with a family. And that family is called a Hanai. Now, Hanai literally means adoption. So when you're Hanai'd, you're adopted by the family. But he soon found out that this is not adoption in a custodial or in a substitute sense. What that adoption meant was two families cared for this individual as one: his biological family and the family of his adoption. And that's such a powerful phrase, that Hanai. And I see it in the agreement that this university, has recently done with the Waksen University in my country, India, where you are going to collaborate, your students are going to collaborate on uplifting the poorer children in the state of Telangana. Hanai, adoption and co-adoption. Because the one thing that we realize again within the space is also the space within each one of us. And the fact that we are who we are, or who we want to be, not by any singular identity, be it our race, our nation, our profession, our belief, but in the beautiful words of Mihaila Moskaliewicz, which I read some time ago, Professor, we are multiple, we have multiple histories. We are a hodgepodge of experiences that need to be sorted out. Think of that space, each one of us, a hodgepodge of experiences, each clamoring to triumph over the other. And sometimes we hold ourselves prisoner to experience. And the United Nations has not been exempt from that at all, because we have held ourselves hostage and prisoner to experiences which we should have resolved in 1945 or soon after. And they do come back to haunt us. But here is where the space for optimism comes in. The fact that you could get every single government in the world to agree on a set of sustainable development goals, not one of them chose to abstain. The fact that you could get every single government in the world to agree on a resolution that would annually mark the Holocaust in the Second World War and educate young minds about the dangers of the Holocaust and its possible recurrence. I'm not going to name names, but you can think of them. This was a resolution that did not have a single opponent. And so that idea of realizing the multiplicity of our beliefs and our identities. And then, of course, the space, if you will, for the unexpected. Most recently, the pandemic. We've had it in so many instances. President Leahy, you and your senior leadership took a pay cut when the pandemic struck, and yet you made sure that you would give students prorated room, mess, parking refunds, and preserve on-campus jobs. I come from a Jesuit school, and one of the great Jesuit minds in this country, whom we lost all too soon, was Father Scott Pillars of the University of Scranton. When the pandemic struck, he was himself in the last stages of ALS. But he made it a point that the university would remain open for students to come, protected, distant, but it will be there as a source of refuge and not compel them to hide behind a screen. And you think of the work that has been done by a young student here, Grace Joyce, on the impact of the pandemic on employment, and of the need to create a space, if you will, for administrative innovation. Think of new unemployment benefits. Think of how to make those benefits wider and more relevant to the times that came in. And that, in a sense, leads on to the space for conscience. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights begins with a phrase that all human beings are endowed with conscience and reason. And it's a deliberate and beautiful choice of phrase, because sometimes conscience and reason may not be mutually inclusive. They may be different. And then the question comes, what do you use? Reason is self-interest, the bottom line, even if you're altruistic. But you can go beyond that to the conscience within you. In the pandemic, 210,000 people were driven out of employment. And yet, a new billionaire emerged virtually every single day. We have 160 million people in poverty as a result of the pandemic. But you still have those who profited from it. And the question, I think, is fair to ask, and Antonio Guterres has asked this, where is the question of conscience there? But more important, where is the question of reason? What does that accumulation of wealth, while more and more people are being deprived of the opportunity to buy the products that you manufacture, do for you in the long run? The entire period of the pandemic, and I'm always lost about what tense to use because I'm not sure whether it's behind us or present continuous, but be that as it may, reminds me of a phrase by Bruce Springsteen, whose papers are cherished in this institution, that the great challenge of adulthood is holding on to your idealism after losing your innocence. So many of us lost our innocence over the last 2 years because we realized that for once, quite literally, life was not in our own hands. And perhaps even more devastatingly, the lives of those we cared for was no longer in our hands. And that brings in, when you lose that innocence, what do you do to the idealism of which Bruce Springsteen spoke? And I think of that as another space, that space for idealism. On the 5th of October, 1966, a group of students broke into the office of the president of Monmouth University and occupied it. They were protesting because the university had advertised housing available to students, and when these students went to take advantage of that housing, they were told they were African American and would not be entitled to it. 5th of October, 1966. The next day, the 6th of October, Monmouth had a visitor. His name was Martin Luther King. And the refrain of his speech was very simple. We must unite to make justice a reality. And the more I have read about Martin Luther King, the more I realize that his definition of justice went far beyond racial justice, community justice. He may well in his time have anticipated what Randy so eloquently speaks of as climate justice. But he hit the point right there where he has said that to make justice a reality, we must unite. Unite as nations, unite as a university community, unite as a community, as a university, and the United Nations. And in that process, and here Martin Luther King used a very national expression, but one which could be adapted internationally, blend the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. He did not live to see it, but it happened. It happened with weaknesses, with aberrations now and then, but it happened. So we come back to the idea of the space for the voiceless versus, if you will, the vocal. And we must remember that voices, even if they cannot be heard, may be stilled, but they are never absent. They're still there in the process of human thought and exchange. We must remember that the voices may be forgotten, but they cannot be ignored. And above all, I think we must remember, as President Leahy once said, that you may be voiceless to the world beyond, but you will never be immune to the voice within you. The voice that you hear, that directs you, that channels you, that warns you, that encourages you. And so we come to this space, if you will, of a vast area of war and peace and justice, of environment, of the UN universities, of the United Nations academic impact. And then here we see both the drama of possibility and yet the infinite nature of human infinitesimalness, if you will. Today's papers, some of you may have seen, carried a news item of how scientists have now discovered a star 12.9 billion light years away from Earth. The earlier supposition was 9 billion light years. Space, where are we in the space? But measure that, if you will, against the space which I believe is most important for us, no matter who we are, no matter what the hodgepodge of our constituents. The space which an Irish Indian writer, Aubrey Menon, described as the space within the heart. Because that is a space that you return to time and again. And believe me, I have seen this on the face of delegates at the United Nations when they're about to press a button, feeling that is how their government would want them to vote. A voice comes from that space within their heart saying, maybe you can take a risk this time and do what you think is right. And the finger moves to an unexpected button. Bruce Springsteen again, and that lovely line in the streets of Philadelphia, where he says, receive me, brother, with your faithless kiss, or shall we leave each other alone like this? That again is what our times and the United Nations are all about. Kisses without faith, without affection. Kisses which, despite that lack of faith and lack of affection, are still a gesture, an extension of solidarity, of community, of oneness, so that not one of us, individual, college, nation, will be left alone like this. I know I have a compatriot here at this university, Lenin Jamir. I don't know if she's here with me, and I know she's working with Rekha, another compatriot of mine. She comes from one of the most beautiful parts of India called Nagaland. Nagaland was the scene of a bitter war between the Japanese and Commonwealth forces, the British, the Australians, and of course the Indians. And there is a war memorial dedicated to them in Kohima, the capital of Nagaland, at the cemetery there. And as you enter, there is what is known as the Kohima epitaph, which reads, when you go home, tell them of us. We gave our today for your tomorrows. Visionaries. These were young men who went to the battle with a vision of coming out of it alive and unscathed and into a world that deserved them. And yet, they were denied that. And they are the emblems of the succeeding generations saved from the scourge of war, of which the United Nations speaks. And so today, we come to the final space of all, that space of confluence of the tomorrow and the today, where we no longer need to give up our tomorrows for someone's today, or our todays for someone's tomorrow, because together we can preserve the right to today and the right to the future generations, the future expectations, the future possibilities of tomorrow. Each one of you associated with this university is so uniquely blessed by being in an institution which does not sacrifice your academic moorings for the right to think, to dream, and yes, to untangle the tangled webs of which Martin Luther King spoke. Because you are a community of minds, and you represent what, to my mind, from another part of the world, is what is best and greatest of the United Nations. Its capacity and its ability to use a space that is sometimes limited, sometimes constraining, sometimes all over the place, to create a world that is worthy of traveling 12.9 billion years to. Thank you.
Now ready for the Q&A session. So if you raise your hand, I can bring the mic to you so you can pose a question.
Yes, yes, thank you.
Hi, so I just wanted to ask in terms of space, something I feel as a student on campus that we struggle with is campus community culture. And I think coming out of at least the virtual schooling over the last 2 years gives us this space and opportunity to come back together. And I think I've seen more of that over the last 6 months than I have the last 4 years. But what type of encouragement would you give towards faculty, staff, and students towards becoming a part of a space that they might feel intimidated to become a part of due to potential judgment or just getting out of their comfort zones?
The aversion to other people's judgment is something which is common, and certainly, just as you mentioned this in the context of the university, I'll also say this in the context of the United Nations, and we've seen that dramatically in the last few weeks, where the way that countries voted on the most recent crisis with which we're involved was seen in some measure as inviting judgment upon their decision. My own view is the premise with which you began, that in a sense, remote learning or the experience we've had of remote learning can be far more intimate than classroom learning, because you're actually seeing a human figure who you're dealing with magnified, and you're really looking into a person's eyes rather than in this room where you're gazing at various people altogether. And that sense of intimacy, I think, also breeds a sense of trust and of community. I can see that if you go into details, obviously people don't want to be judged by the state of the room they're in or the dress that they're wearing and so on. But I think those almost become apocryphal stories. What is far more important is that thanks to the leadership of universities in this country and by and large the world over, we were able to convert which could have been 2 years of complete pause to higher education, which served its purpose in terms of examinations and degrees and so on, but also instilled a larger, if possibly more vulnerable, sense of community.
Other questions?
I'm going to tell you.
Sure.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I really appreciate them. And just building on space, I guess my question goes to how maybe the UN, governments, and universities have been safe spaces where people have come together. But I think there's an erosion of trust in institutions like that. So, I feel like your characterization of the individual is almost one that shares responsibilities and rights, but individualism and others seem to be undercutting the institutional trust in institutions as safe spaces for that coming together that I think you were wanting us to do. So I wonder if you could expand a little bit on your thoughts about why the public is losing trust in these institutions.
I would say that if there is a loss of trust, it's primarily attributable to two factors, and both of which actually really relate to your own area of work and expertise. One is a lack of a credible universal governance mechanism in specific areas, in your case, ocean management, but you can go across that to human rights, to climate, whatever you choose to deal with. And the second element is the increased territoriality, if you will, of these agreements as being within the province of governments and not the larger community of scholars, of civil society organizations, and those who have as much of a role to play. I think a lot of this is actually to be done at the national level. One point that really disquiets me is that, to my knowledge, there is virtually no government in the world that tries to infuse its population with a respect for and a faith in the United Nations. They go to the United Nations, they make speeches there, they're reported back home, but it's really the government that is in focus, not the organization itself. If you were able to create the animal convention, for instance, which I refer to, or a more robust legal regime for the coastline with which we've been working, and then persuade the community that this has only been possible because you have a space to consult, to get expertise, to get advice, and above all, to go back to Michael's phrase, let's try this and see if it works, and if it doesn't, move on to something else. But half the effort, or more than half, is real in that trial.
First of all, congratulations on the well-deserved award, and thank you for a very inspiring speech.
Thank you.
You talked a lot about spaces and the importance that these spaces hold. My question relates to the youth. How would you encourage or advise the youth of today to establish spaces for us to feel as a part of a global community and a global citizen?
Again, I'm probably about half a century out of date, but I would, frankly, if my generation in school or college had the ability to create what I would, for want of a better phrase, call the electronic space, about being able to communicate to the person next door or to the person half a world away on ideas that matter, there is so much more I feel that could have been done. My only, again, possibly gratuitous comment or advice on that would be to try and be more definitive in the space that you're trying to work. It's very easy to say that youth should occupy space, but what should that youth occupy the space for? Is it climate change? If it is climate change, what within climate change? Is it sanitation and water management? Is it desertification? Is it forests? And then bring together minds. Because, and this goes back to what we were discussing earlier, that is really the germ of expertise what comes in. To give you just one very small instance from the part of the world that I grew up in 2008, it was schoolgirls in Delhi, India, who went to shops tearing down the plastic bags which are hanging from hooks and refusing to let anyone buy something in that shop and take a plastic bag home. The police challenged them and went to court. The court sided with these girls, and plastic bags were outlawed in India. So change is absolutely possible at the experiential level, in the sense of sharing experiences and creating protests, which this country has had a very rich history of and a very purposeful history, and so has mine. But beyond that, it's also space for the intellectual exchange of ideas, of possibilities, of what can be done. And when you find something completely unexpected happening in Ecuador, and find that it could relate to the mountains of Eastern Africa, then you've made your discovery.
I just have a comment. I don't have a question. Questions are for students, right? You have the right to and privilege to ask questions. The question that was just asked of you was from Len Junior, and she is the student from Nagaland. She came to Monmouth on a tennis scholarship in the height of COVID because she trusted Monmouth University. I just wanted to introduce Len.
Thank you. Wonderful to meet you. There's something.
Yes. My question relates to, well, actually, first of all, I just want to say that I highly resonate with this, topic of space, developing this concept more. My question relates to potentially the negative spaces, specifically virtual online spaces where you see, in this country especially, individuals get, radicalized online by potentially damaging misinformation. So I was wondering what role the UN specifically could have in mitigating this misinformation and polarization pushed by negative online spaces through education, particularly. What role the UN has played in mitigate this impact or has already like been contributed to? Thank you.
Thank you. That's very critical and very timely. There are three specific areas in which the United Nations is working in that regard. The first is being a forum which brings together the large communications tech companies, if you will, Facebook, Twitter, and bring them all together and see whether there is a code of conduct that they're able to implement and monitor in terms of hate speech and misinformation online. The second, and this is where the the United Nations itself works closely with UNESCO, the educational arm of the organization, where the national governments can be encouraged and guided in terms of legislation on hate speech and misinformation within their own provinces. And so each country will have a different definition. And I think the one thing that we've realized is that the more global you make such a convention, the more anodyne it is. It does tend to lack teeth unless you have the muscle of a state behind it, which is why in this case, it might be better to have 193 covenants against misinformation, supplementing the one overarching area of all. And the third really is what we are going to focus, or the United Nations is going to focus this year in a global summit on education in September. And when the summit was planned on education, first of all, it was pre-pandemic, but even then, as it evolved during the last 2 years, the initial thrust was education as you and I most obviously understand it, getting more children into school, opening up more university opportunities, lifelong learning, adult education, and so on. And then suddenly, we found that these had almost, not quite, but almost been superseded by the most vital education of all, the education to question, to challenge, to suspect, and not to mislead. And where does an educational institution, whether it be of the stature of Monmouth or a little school in a village in southern India, where does that responsibility come in? And that, I think, is going to be the redefining moment for the United Nations involvement in education.
In modern age, I personally have seen a rise in like mental health issues or illnesses that kind of restrain the youth to put themselves out there and join different like community spaces and build like bonding experiences with other people. What kinds of words of encouragement or plans do you think would be useful to help our younger generation be more proactive in like community and like, you know, spaces for the future?
Thank you. It's always amazed me over the last 20 or 30 years, particularly working at the United Nations. You find so many issues that were once considered taboo, intimate, personal, which were never discussed in intergovernmental meetings, are now out there at the fore. Reproductive health and all its dimensions is one of them. But yet, there is still this coyness, if you will, about addressing mental health, as you've mentioned. What we've discussed earlier about the increase in virtual space might help because it's easier now to relate to a person impersonally rather than go and sit in front of someone and admit what you feel is despairing you. So that might be one possible avenue towards this. But I think we should also at some point consider, and I defer to President Leahy and other academic leaders on this, whether there needs to be an element of compulsion involved, that any institution that deals with human beings should have a resource for those who are uncomfortable with the state of their mental health.
Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I have one question. So what do you think the role of UN media specifically is in places laws are rather strict. Is it possible to create those sort of spaces? And if so, how?
One thing that the United Nations has been consistent about, and there's always going to be a difference of opinion about whether that is a strength or a weakness, is it does not attempt to supersede or overwhelm national laws. So if a particular government or a country has a code in place, whatever it be, the United Nations will, through general declamation or statement or resolution, speak about the wisdom of not having that particular force in place. But it's not going to go and try and subvert it by working outside the constituency of the government, because it is an organization ultimately of governments and member states. But again, what you will see is that if you look, for instance, at the two awards that I would encourage you to look at, one is the award given by UNESCO on World Press Freedom Day on the 3rd of May every year. And you look at the awardees, these are for individuals who have defied censorship in a specific geographical and political situation. And then you go to a non-UN award, like the Nobel Peace Prize, which was awarded most recently to a journalist in the Philippines, who again had been taking a stand against that of the government of that country. So without going to the merits of this, because it becomes a question of having to go to each individual case, I think we're by and large in a position that we've not been before, where those who censor are increasingly being called out, being challenged, and what is important, being called out and being challenged not only by well-wishers abroad, but by those who want to preserve the integrity of their home.
Students want to ask a question, but we withdraw. Looks like they don't, so can I ask a question now?
Please, Rekha.
First of all, thank you for taking us through this remarkable journey and the connections you made. I learned more about Monmouth University history in my 29 years of teaching here. I did not know so many of the stories, which I don't know how you do. It's just amazing. So thank you. And connecting that to the world level and international dynamics and everything. Today, one of the connections you did not make is that we are meeting today, March 31st, the last day of the Women's History Month. So I will make my question, I will frame in those terms. The United Nations has sometimes been referred to in the image of a woman, and in that image, unfortunately, the role that the United Nations is said to be playing, or be best suited to play, is the role of a cleanup agent, or somebody who would go in and clean up after a war. The United Nations has been criticized for not being able to prevent a war, but all it can do is go in there and basically clean up job, sometimes years, sometimes decades after an active conflict. So if you could please respond to that question in terms of the perceived weakness in the role of the United Nations to prevent active conflict.
Thank you, Rekha ji. If we are going to use a gender metaphor, I think a much more compelling one would be that of a midwife. Because I think what the United Nations has done is to literally give birth to so many accords of international understanding on such a diversity of issues, which really regulate the world that we're in today. And some of you may be familiar with the story of how the moment you get onto an aeroplane, you're really being facilitated by the United Nations. The plane is able to go from Frankfurt to Dubai because the United Nations has brought the United Arab Emirates and Germany together in the International Civil Aviation Organization. The German pilot is able to land in Dubai because under ICAO laws, all pilots have to speak English. When you're on the plane and watching a film, You're watching that film because the World Intellectual Property Organization has allowed the creator of that film both her copyright and the ability to extend it to a wider audience. If you're daring and you order a meal on the plane, you're actually going to a system called Codex, which is an alliance between the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization, which is to certify every meal served on an aircraft. If your destination in Dubai is going to take you to archaeological or historic sites, you come across preservation by UNESCO. So there's no single aspect of our lives that is not touched in some way by the United Nations. And some of you may remember in the early days of laptops, we had a little sticker saying Intel inside. And like that, if you look at the world today in whatever we do, you can find that sticker, UN inside. But to go to your specific question, Rekhaji, about why have we been able to prevent war? It is because, to my mind, a deliberate denial of what the United Nations is premised on, the premise of collective action. And the moment that any nation feels that its interests are not being protected by collective action by the world community, then that nation will feel encouraged or emboldened, or at times just despairingly forced to go into action on its own, which leads to the situations that you meet. And what we really have to reflect upon is why have we failed that avenue of collective action? And this is something, for all its record, in 77 years, in the thousands of Security Council resolutions that have maintained the peace, there have been instances where peace has been broken or has not happened. And each one, I accept, is one too many. But we have to look both at the specifics of the immediate situation and the larger sense of where we are within the space of international community, where we realize again that we cannot only be thinking of today or of tomorrow, but of them together.
Just a quick question. Thank you for a very inspirational presentation. Historically, there has been so much disempowerment, dispossession, dehumanization. How can we rehumanize space so that we can enable dialogue, forgiveness, understanding to develop? And I think there is a need to have internal work and be inspired in multiple ways to bring about that ability to cross the border and reach out to the other and engage in dialogue, forgiveness, and reconciliation.
Absolutely. I think you put it so eloquently there. Where the United Nations really comes in is in its role also as a convening forum. And it has gone far beyond, as you know well, the convening forum of governments to a convening forum of universities, of civil society. But above all, I think what needs to be understood by all of us is that the United Nations does not claim to be exclusive. There will be so many initiatives around the world, and there are so many in the part of the world that you are such a prolific writer and thinker about, West Asia and the Middle East, where you have minds who get together and who engage little by little, enlarging that space of a common humanity. To that, I would only add, going back to what I've always felt, the power of education. And the power, I know that in another university in New Jersey, its president 20 years ago, this is Michael Adams at Fairleigh Dickinson, had a rule that every student must subscribe to and read a newspaper from another country each day. And then you should see the way that Horizons expanded, with students talking about petrol prices in Thailand and why that was a crisis. So that idea of relating the immediate to what threatens to become immediate, if you allow it to, is really at the core, I think, of that principle.
questions or comments? There's one comment online that I think is a nice opportunity, a nice note to close things out on. It's from Dr. Padmini Murthy. And she says, thank you for organizing this excellent program. Hearty congratulations, Mr. Damodaran, for this recognition and award. Very well deserved. And those of us in the academic and NGO communities are grateful and thankful to you for all your dedication and commitment to promote the culture of peace through education. Thank you for your brilliance in creating and nurturing the United Nations academic impact, which is a boon for institutions of higher learning.
Thank you.
I think those are very fitting words on which to close. And on behalf of our in-person and online audiences, thank you very much for your thoughtful and inspiring words. We're all very enriched for that and grateful to have had you as our guest.
Thank you, sir.
Alice.
I have your microphone. Take it.
Yes, we're gonna put it on the IG webpage. It could be up 5 minutes. Oh, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for covering it. We're very grateful to see all the outlook stories on the IGU and UCI.
I'm Abigail.
Abigail, that's right. Great. Yes, I see your name. Oh,
Well,
thank you too.
I will.
I'll cover for you.
This is the president's symbol.
Oh, wait, yeah.
There's more space for everyone. Create space.
If you go, I'll go.
You need more women.
Oh, well, then that's me. Up.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Wonderful to see you again. I can't believe that you remembered from 2015.
15, that's right.
And then we celebrated you on behalf of Congo in 2020 virtually, and now you're here at Monmouth again. That's wonderful.
So it's
Thank
right
you.
by
And I, you know, when we first met in 2016, we were sure you could talk about anything. You said that, right?
So maybe
And you
I can go
can,
back
and you do incredible homework.
Yes,
about
the
that.
front door of Doherty House.
Stuff about
Luann Russell will be
Here,
there.
I'll let you
Great.
go. Because I'll be seeing you. Okay.
Well, I'm just disappointed that they changed the special event.
The next time the semester in our residence.
I did
Oh, you did go.
I did it in person. But it was really good. It was just had a nice variety of speakers and you can watch it also. They have the recording.
Yeah. Great. So you're going to write something about that?
Yeah. Depends if we go to the one of the 18s, because then it'll just be just that one.
Oh, okay. So you're walking or driving with the crazy weather, we should drive.
I'm gonna drive. I parked over by the dining hall, so we can quick escape from here.
Yeah.
They just started it. So we're talking about it. And I would really love to see that happening here. And I think we have to. So thank you.
I remember your reference to Scott.
Great thing, everything you said. Great.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Good show. Thank you. See you over? Yes, okay.
So that is again the woman we are constantly stop engaging. That sort of thing. It's challenging to narrative. I just hinted when I said that. Sorry. Perception connected to so we are like in 2003 and now unfortunately countries such as Belize NATO and United States and now try and see if there is a way of, if you look at the objections that are shown, they're all negotiable.
Right. I think your answer to that is Dallas. Nations sort of, okay, so to sort of summarize.
No, that's good, but that's an absolutely valid. In the sense that when the invasion occurred, it was the counter was really I mean, I still feel there's the incremental with the budget. It's and now with you asking about the amount of money to it, because they're also willing to accept autonomy. So why do you follow that?
Well, I mean,
What is your real specialty? Bro.
Space. Environmental nurture so that's what they concept of space and place we talk about and just involving sort of concept of space here or just routine right very strong presentation. I don't mean to like lay on top of
No. So good to see you. No, thank you.
Congratulations.
Thanks so much. Thanks. Good to see you.
Okay. What's up?
Thanks for coming out.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's Rick's got some. Yeah, and
Yeah.